So first of all, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us and welcome to the Prescribed Fire for Marsh Bird Conservation webinar hosted by the Prescribed Burn Alliance of Texas in partnership with the NOAA FireBird Project. We have a really exciting talk today. We're going to hear from Dr. Chris Butler first, and then after we hear about his project, we're going to open it up to a general Q&A and discussion on all things prescribed fire along the coast and elsewhere. But first and foremost, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our main speaker, or Dr. Chris Butler. So Dr. Butler serves as an instructional associate professor of biology at Texas A&M University in College Station. His research centers on avian ecology with a particular emphasis on the behavior and conservation of secretive marsh birds. He earned his PhD in zoology from Oxford University and was awarded the Fulbright Scholarship to Botswana in 2016 to 2017, where he conducted ecological field research focused on African bird populations. For the past 5 years, Dr. Butler has played a key role in the NOAA FireBird Project, an interdisciplinary effort investigating how prescribed fire in coastal salt marshes influences bird communities. His work examines species such as the yellow rail, mottled duck, and the federally threatened eastern black rail, helping to inform both fire management and conservation strategies across the Gulf Coast. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Butler. Dr. Butler, if people have questions, would you like them to save it for the Q&A, or would you like them to pop them in the chat or raise their hands during your talk? What works best for you?
Why don't we do the questions at the end?
Okay.
I can be a little long-winded. I'll try not to be. It's the drawback of being a professor. So if we do the questions at the end, that way it'll be as concise as possible with the presentation.
Perfect. Sounds great. All right. Well, then I will go ahead and mute myself and turn it over to you.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come to this. I'm Chris Butler. I'm over in A&M in College Station in the Department of Biology. Came here a few years back, and then before that, I was up in Oklahoma. I'm one small cog in this pretty big multidisciplinary group looking at the effects of prescribed burning on certain vocal species of birds in the Gulf Coast marshes. So I think there's like 13 different institutions. We're all cooperating on this project. It was funded by the NOAA Restore Act. And we are wrapping up the 5 years. We've started putting together a burn manual that'll summarize these things. So I'm going to hit some of the key points in this presentation, and then once the burn manual is out, it'll go into more detail and provide more nuance and so on. So anyway, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, coastal salt marshes, there we go. So salt marsh habitat depends on inundation. So during low tides, the water will be lapping at the edge of things like Spartina alterniflora. And then at high tide, it'll start covering some of the stuff like Spartina patens and so on. And then as you go slightly higher in elevation, you get a shift to different grass species. You get bulrush, you get needle rush. You can get all the way up to like Phragmites and so on. So high marsh is irregularly flooded. It doesn't flood during every high tide, but there will be high water events that will flood the high marsh. And then for most of the time, the high marsh is not covered with water. So this is more or less what high marsh looks like. So you have these clumpy Spartina grasses. So things like Spartina alterniflora, Spartina bograia, and so on. And then you'll have pathways in between there where the grass isn't really growing. And then because this is grass, it is susceptible to woody vegetation encroachment. So given time, things like bacchus will move in and some other woody vegetation. So trying to keep this as grassy stuff can be kind of tricky. You want to figure out things like the time of burn, intervals between it, what effects it's going to have, and so on. And if you have things like backrest in the system, it can be particularly tricky because, for example, the heat from the fire will cause the seeds to disperse pretty easily. So with high salt marsh, and with the NOAA Restore project that we did, Project FireBird, we chose 3 species that were of particular interest. So the black rail was federally listed as threatened in 2020, so 5 years ago, and the population has crashed. So when we first started doing the NOAA FireBird project, our first sample of 300 odd sites, I think, we ended up finding black rails in only 6 of them. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out how to keep them around in areas where they still occur. Mottled duck is another one of our focal species. They're a species of conservation concern. The populations in Texas have been undergoing a decline for a while now. They may have leveled off lately. They may still be declining, but around a 78-ish% decline in the population in Texas, a little more stable in Louisiana. And then there's also this yellow rail, the little guy down there at the bottom left. The yellow rails are a species of conservation concern. They breed in Canada and the northern US. They winter along the Gulf Coast, and they're not a particularly well-studied species. So for the project, we wanted to investigate how prescribed fire might influence the ecology, the numbers, and so on of these focal species. So the eastern black rail population, if you look on the map on the top right, you can see a little dot in Colorado. So the eastern black rail is that little dot in Colorado down through Texas and Mexico and over along the East Coast. And the range used to be far more expansive. So they used to breed, for example, in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, up through New York, down through, Mississippi, Alabama, and so on. And then during the 20th century, the range contracted, and that contraction has picked up speed. So it seems likely that some of this has been due to habitat loss, but there's also likely other things at play because other marsh birds haven't declined to the same extent. They're a tough species to study. They don't like to fly, so when you come across them skulking on the ground, okay. Yeah, so when you come across them, if you come across them, they're skulking on the ground. Most often you would hear them by their vocalizations. So in coastal areas, you can hear them do this occasional peek-a-deer. And if you're at like Galveston Island State Park, for example, there's still several there. And if you listen at night, you can hear them in the high marsh. The population along the Gulf is really fragmented. So there's some that are breeding in Florida. There are some that are breeding in Texas. We've just recently rediscovered them breeding in parts of Southwest Louisiana. But they are having a tough go of it. Mottled ducks are year-round residents on the Gulf Coast. There's a couple of different subspecies. So there's one in Florida that extends its breeding range up to South Carolina. And then you have one that breeds from Mississippi, maybe Alabama, over along the Western Gulf. They have been undergoing a fairly steep decline as well. So a long-term one that isn't quite as stark as the black rails, but the numbers continue to tick down in Texas. Louisiana, the picture is a little more muddled, but they seem to be more or less stable-ish in Louisiana. And then the yellow rail winters along the Gulf Coast. So it's present there from late October up until late April or so. And it breeds in the northern US and Canada. They're hard to find, just like the black rails. They like to skulk around in that marsh vegetation. And unlike the black rails, they don't really vocalize very much. So the vocalization that they give during the winter was just described 2 years ago. So actually coming across them is really challenging. You can sometimes see them scurrying away from like an area that's been mowed if you're mowing around levees and dikes and things like that. And Louisiana has a little Yellow Rails and Rice Festival where they've got some agro-tourism going on, where farmers who are going through the rice fields in October and November will coordinate to have people ride in the tractors and see the yellow rails getting fleshed up, which is pretty cool. So anyway, with Firebird, what we were really interested in was trying to look into some of the nuance and details about how prescribed fire in high marsh can be used to benefit our focal species, particularly with the black rails becoming threatened. There's an urgent need to know how to manage what's still left, and ideally, it'd be great if we could manage to restore areas so that they could come back and use them again. So this had a number of different parts to it, and I'll focus mostly on the prescribed burning. But for example, if you're burning in Florida, if you're burning in Texas, people are looking for slightly different things along the Gulf in terms of the wind conditions and so on. And you have a limited amount of time to burn when things are dormant. So if you're theoretically, when you're putting this all together, you've got maybe, so let's say 120 days when you could have your fire crew out there and burning. But then with local conditions, you might have only 50 or 60 days when you can actually get the burn going. And so there's been anecdotal evidence to suggest that the number of good burn days has gradually been declining, which makes it harder to fit in prescribed burning recommendations. So one of the things we looked at was, are circulation patterns changing? Are the number of potential burn days declining? And this paper came out from the group a couple of years back. And the upshot of it is that things aren't really changing that much in terms of circulation patterns affecting burning and so on. So there are social constraints on burning. Things like smoke, for example, can be problematic around human population centers when people have asthma and so on. And so there are serious social constraints in the use of prescribed fire on the landscape. But in terms of atmospheric circulation, there's not really very much that seems to be changing that's affecting when burns can happen. The next thing that we had to do was actually work out where high marsh is, which turned out to be surprisingly tricky. And so if you're going to manage high marsh, you want a good map of where high marsh occurs. And when we started this project, there were areas that were labeled as salt marsh and marsh and so on. But they didn't actually explicitly break out high marsh. And that made it a little tricky to figure out where study sites should be, what we'd be looking for, and so on. And so what we did is in 21, there was a group of us around the Gulf that went out and mapped out where high salt marsh was on the ground to ground truth it. And then Nicholas Enright and his group used remote sensing to correlate the ground truthing stuff with satellite imagery. And then we went back out to verify the accuracy of it. So there's a subtle nuance in the end product here. The end product is irregularly flooded marsh rather than strictly high marsh. But it does give us our first glimpse at where high marsh type stuff is around the Gulf, which is really useful for trying to figure out, for example, like where the black rails might be. And then as we were mapping out these things, we wanted to try and come up with some predictions about bird and prescribed burn relationships. And so there were a series of meetings with various managers and experts to try and figure out what sort of characteristics we needed to look for, how to set this up, what would actually be useful for people, and so on. And so a series of adaptive management meetings, and those are still going on today as we're working on the process of building on this study. We also did field work. So across the 5 states, so Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, we would have field crews go out and engage in data collection. And so for some of them, we would actually go out with drag lines during the non-breeding season and try to kick up some of these rails to see if they were present in the area. During the breeding season, we would set up autonomous recording units, basically microphones in the marsh, and see what was vocalizing. For the mottled ducks, we were looking for drop flights and hopefully trying to find some nests where we could. And so with some of these fieldwork things, we started being able to get at characteristics of the landscape that seem to affect occupancy for our focal species. So the black rails, for example, seem to like sites that had pretty dense, widespread canopy, and then were open underneath. So because the grass can be clumpy, the clumps would kind of grow over and touch each other, and you would have what we dubbed railways running underneath them. And so the black rails liked those clumpy spartina habitats with the railways underneath them. And then they also tended to be found in areas that had a duff layer, dead vegetation underneath, and greater overall species richness. With the mottled ducks were using the high salt marsh, but we weren't finding as many of them as we anticipated. And so it made it a little tricky to draw firm conclusions about vegetative predictors of breeding mottled ducks in high marsh. We could draw some conclusions about the surrounding marsh, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And so once we had a feel for if circulation patterns were changing, where the high marsh was, what sort of habitat fire relationships we were looking for, what sort of specific details about the habitat the birds were queuing in on, then we could start looking into how to affect some of these things with prescribed fire. And then, almost forgot this bit, but when we were doing this, we were finding black rails in some areas, and the abundance seemed to be a little bit different between winter and spring, suggesting that perhaps some of the black rails were migrants from Kansas or Colorado or so on. And so we actually ended up banding a pretty good number of black rails over the course of the study. And we got some feathers from South Carolina and Virginia from collaborators. And we found there were small numbers of migrants, so around 7% of the birds that were showing up on the coast in Louisiana and Texas were migrants. We weren't finding any northern black rails in Florida. So with all that, we started looking into how prescribed burning might affect some of these key things. So, darn typos, they get into everything. But anyway, the goals of the Firebird manual that is currently being put together and should be out next summer, where we wanted to create recommendations for kind of 5 key factors that people can actually manipulate. So, I mean, it's nice to know like the rails, like the grass of this size, or that they want the railways, or that the ducks are using this area. But there's, you need to know how to actually get there. And so that's kind of what the bulk of this, the rest of this is going to be. So the 5 things we were trying to put together with this fire manual are, you wanted to know like the frequency in which your management units should be treated. Is it a 2-year burn? Is it a 4-year burn? The season in which the unit is treated, everybody burns coastal stuff during the dormant season. Hopefully that's okay, but would it perhaps be better to try and do it during the growing season? The extent of the burn, the specific weather conditions, and the ignition techniques. These are all, relevant and things that people can control, and that could potentially affect the habitat in a way that would better support these focal species. So with fires in coastal ecosystems, there's kind of 3 broad categories that you can really think about. You can have cover burns, and the cover burns are kind of going to move quickly through the flammable vegetation. They kill the stuff above the ground, but they don't kill things below the ground. If you have a buildup of plant material you can get the fire to move more slowly. As it moves more slowly, you can end up with root burns. And so that'll kill some of the plant tissues below the ground. And then if you have low water tables, if you have high fuel loadings and you have sufficient heat, you can get peat burns. And so you have below ground plant tissues kind of smoldering away and burning. So with those sorts of things, ideally, what you're mostly trying to go for is going to be cover burns. So along the Gulf, modify this just so that people can see this. It's going back there. So along the Gulf, the high marsh plant communities are dominated by these grasses. Spartina, the genus was actually changed to Sparabilis a decade ago, but everyone still calls them Spartina. And it's mostly Spartanae, patens, and bakeri. And so Spartina has these hundreds of thin, narrow little leaves that are going to grow out from basal tufts. And they grow for up to like a year, and then they senesce. And so you've got little clumps of dead grass there. And those dry stalks will then bend and fold over onto the neighboring plants, and then they'll persist for years. And so on average in our study sites, for the various clumps of grass that we looked at, the spacing between those clumps was about a quarter meter. And so you have the railways in between them, and you have it kind of folded over, but with airflow underneath, it allows the ground fires to travel pretty quickly. So the heat that's generated above the ground is substantial, but because you've got good airflow, you also have it moving pretty quick. And so the fires pass pretty quickly. They don't usually generate enough heat to kill below ground plant tissues. And then post-fire, some of the new leaves sprout pretty quickly, and then they will senesce again. The response obviously depends upon local environmental conditions. So things like precipitation have a huge effect. Things in Florida, for example, were growing back much faster than things on like the Texas midcoast. So the productivity that happens on these high marshes is really pretty impressive. You get a very good flush of growth coming back out. And usually the biomass gets back to around its pre-burn biomass within about a year. Again, with variation depending upon the precipitation and the soil and salinity and so on. If you have burns that are conducted with low surface soil moistures, those end up killing a good chunk of the hardwood shrubs. If the soil moisture is higher, you end up killing a considerably smaller number of the hardwood shrubs. And so with prescribed fire, you're trying to manage this whole woody vegetation encroachment. You're trying to have the habitat be suitable for this threatened species and some of the other species of conservation concern, and so on. And prescribed fire in general tends to mimic the effects of natural fire better than mowing or chopping or herbicides and so on. So with prescribed fire, and I'm just kind of putting this in here because I think from what I saw of the list of people, there's a range of expertise here. So for some people who might find this interesting, prescribed fire has differences that help ensure safety. You have to control like how much the area is burned, which way the smoke is going, and so on and so forth. And so the techniques are designed overall to yield controlled, low severity cover burns. The question becomes, what happens if there are rare species in the area? What effects do the fires have in terms of not just the habitat, but also direct or indirect mortality? So depending on how you set up the fires, you can have the fires burn quickly or slowly. And that in turn can affect things like indirect and direct mortality. So if you have something like a strip head fire, the picture on the left, for example, you could have your perimeter done pretty quickly and the winds are blowing and pushing the flames along, and you could burn this particular unit in less than an hour. If you're doing it against the winds with something like a flanking fire, the interior burns much more slowly, and you would do the perimeter as necessary. And then you can also do backing fires, and that burns it more slowly still. There are advantages and disadvantages to all these sorts of things, and these are just some of the different ways that fires can be set. But one of the issues that you can have with things like the rails is because they don't really like to fly. A quick moving fire can induce mortality in the rails. A slower moving fire gives them the chance to get out ahead of it and get away from it. And so with things like the fire frequency, you are trying to replicate the frequency of natural fire events. In an ideal situation, there are always logistical concerns with doing prescribed burning. There will be, how much can you actually fit into a year, how much is available, and so on. But fire frequency is one of those really important factors that people can control to an extent, because it's linked with changes in the vegetation. So fire can modify the vegetation. This is just, again, kind of as a high-level thing. And the fire frequency can affect equipment and personnel needs. So if you're trying to burn a site every 2 years, you're trying to burn it every 4 years, the 2 years is much more of an effort to burn frequently than a 4-year one. And there are, in a marsh with equipment, stuff breaks on a regular basis. Burn bans will pop up, especially in Texas, and there's limited personnel. And so there's a range of ways to approach this, but actually burning during that 120-day window can be kind of tricky to get everything in. So in Texas, historically, a lot of the fires would have been caused by lightning. And so the figure over here on the left just shows flash density, lightning strikes. So there's considerable variation on the coast. Brownsville, Port Mansfield, South Padre Island would have considerably fewer lightning strikes per square kilometer than, say, Beaumont, Port Arthur, what have you. And then there's also changes in how fast the vegetation would recover that couples in with precipitation. So around Brownsville, you might get 25 or 30 inches of rain. Up by Port Arthur and Beaumont, you're getting like 60 inches of rain or so. And the rainfall rates will influence how fast things grow back. So one of the things we had to be careful of with the FireBird project was the stuff that works well in, let's say, Florida or southern Mississippi may not have the right fire frequency for portions of Texas because the rainfall rates are going to be different. So there was a paper by Stombaugh in 2014 that summarized some of the existing literature on fire frequency and fire return intervals in Texas. And so the first one, Frost from 1988, was pretty coarse, and it argued or suggested that the majority of time in like upland prairies and woods, fires would burn every 1 to 3 years right along the coast. And then because high salt marsh is sort of adjacent to that, it should also presumably burn every 1 to 3 years. And then the dunes, the barriers would burn less often. The paper by Guyette argued for more like 3 to 4 years. And then the more fine scale map by Keene, which was called Landfire, argued anywhere from like 1 to 15 years, depending upon local conditions. So there's a range of what was considered to be a natural fire return interval along the coast of Texas. So for the FireBird project, we were not able to obviously run this for like 15 years, but we could compare things like 2-year and 4-year fire return intervals to look and see what effects they might have on the vocal species. And so for these high marshes, largely what you're going for is trying to control woody vegetation encroachment. And the current guidelines for black rails are recommending limiting the extent of hardwood shrubs to less than, say, 20% of the unit, and then trying to promote herbaceous cover between like a 0.5 meter and 1.5 meters across most of the unit. And so if you kind of look at what people are doing in Florida, stuff in Florida is growing back really quick. And 2 years is recommended for Florida. If you look at Texas, things in Texas don't grow back quite as quickly. And so you may need a longer fire return interval. So with burning season, natural fires would tend to occur when low rainfall would heighten lightning activity. But that also means that you can get it not just like during the dormant season, but also like during the summer droughts and so on. And so natural fires and prescribed burning can differ a little bit in when they are moving across the landscape. So like with hardwood mortality, it tends to be higher in salt marshes when the burns are conducted during the growing season, because the baccharis and the other shrubs are moving carbohydrates up into the entire plant. And there are seasonal considerations that are going to vary by species. So like black rails are breeding in the spring, yellow rails are only present in the winter, and so on. And then the variations in the burn extents can also affect avian taxa. And so what they're recommending at the moment for black rails are going to be patchy burns. And so if you want patchy burns, usually you're trying to do your burns earlier in the day, because then you've got cooler conditions, the relative humidity is higher, there's still some dew and so on the fuel. And you can also tweak this a bit by using different firing techniques to sort of go for a patchy burn and leave some refugia for the birds to retreat to. So topography, fuel type, extent of the management units, those are all fixed. Like there's not much you can do about that. But the weather changes can also have pretty substantial impacts on what the burn outcome is going to look like. So the patchy burns tend to come out if you have relatively high humidity. They tend to have low wind speeds, burns that are initiated early in the day. And so if you're trying to go for a patchy burn under an ideal situation, it might be, say, something like 3 days, within 3 days of a rain event, with having a fair bit of moisture on your fuel, relative humidity about 50%, have cloudy conditions, light winds, and so on. So with our focal species, with the black rail, there are year-round individuals, and there's also some that are coming in for the winter. And so regular burning should promote the preferred structure, giving you the clumpy grass and these little railways that they can run through. There were differences in natural fire frequencies across the 5 states that we looked at. And there were also some concerns for direct, indirect mortality and temporary loss of usable space. So if you've got a rare population of black rails, you have to burn the habitat to keep the woody vegetation out. But if you've only got small numbers of them, they need to have refugia to go to. And if they're moving from one area to the next, they could get picked off by predators and so on. So this is a case study of what not to do if you're trying to manage for black rails. So this happened at St. John's National Wildlife Refuge in Florida in January 1995, and it resulted in 34 dead black rails that got picked up after the fire. And so what had happened was you had this 2,400-acre unit that needed to be burned. And it took a while to get everything set up. So the control lines were completed by 3:30 in the afternoon. You had maybe 3 hours to finish the burn. And so what they did was they used the helicopters to drop those little delayed aerial ignition devices. And the ignition proceeded quickly, and things kind of burned in towards the middle from all sides effectively. And so as it was burning, people noticed a couple spots weren't getting scorched, and so they burned those as well. So by having this complicated burn moving in towards the middle, the rails couldn't figure out, we think, which way to go. And you ended up having significant mortality of black rails and then some other birds in the areas too. So king rail, clapper rail, sora, and so on. And so 2 years later, they had a different approach to doing this quick burn, and that actually seems to have worked fairly well. So with the rails, because they're not flying, the quick burns through the habitat can be problematic for keeping them around. In terms of how they respond to post-burn, there was a study by Amanda Haverland in 2019 who did this as her PhD research for Texas State. And she found that the black rails that she was coming across were in the study plots that were anywhere from like 27 to 76 months post-burn. So it took them a couple years to come back to the area after their burning. And so obviously, if you're trying to figure out your fire return interval, if you were doing it literally every 24 months, the utility of that habitat for the black rails in that particular area is minimal at best. Some of the plots in Texas and Louisiana were growing back faster, and so we found them popping up within 7 months, but we weren't necessarily finding them consistently there. We think they may have been moving over temporarily from refugia nearby. They'd investigate the area and then they'd leave again. In Florida, everything grew really fast, and so they were popping into those plots within about 2 months after a burn, and within, let's say, 6 to 7 months, they seem to be somewhat regular. So what we found as things were growing back, if you had areas that had really dense ground level stem cover, so greater than 75%, so that these railways got really clogged, the black rails tended not to use them. If you had herbaceous canopy cover greater than 74%, so if it got too dense on top as well, they tended not to use them as well. Well, they needed some cover, but not too much. And then a little bit of duff on the ground seemed to be helpful as well. There were also some other interesting things that you could pick out. So if you're just trying to evaluate it visually to do this, because it can be kind of a pain to go through and measure things with a ruler and say, is this 63 meters tall? Basically, you're looking for stuff that is not quite waist high, where the grass grown over in clumps and there's pathways between them. If you've got that and you don't have a bunch of woody stuff, then the habitat is reasonable for black rails to use it. With the mottled ducks, the populations seem to be affected by woody encroachment. The regular burning of up to like 4 years or so has resulted in grass-dominated sites across most study areas for this project, and you have fewer shrubs. They really liked having that sort of clumpy Spartina for rearing hatch broods. And so in terms of the timing, obviously, if you're doing it during the growing season, you can destroy the nests. If you do a burn early on and they've started nesting really early, they can potentially come back and breed. So burns can happen, say, in February, for example, and some of the mottled ducks in Texas have started breeding in February. And so if you do that, you potentially lose the nests. But then as things grow back, depending on how quickly they grow back, they will sometimes re-nest in the summer. So the earlier the burn occurs, the more likely it is that there's going to be suitable nest site conditions by the end of the breeding season. And if you can have large tracts of nesting habitats and then wetlands nearby with open water for them to be on, that seems to improve nestling recruitment. Yellow rails. With yellow rails, the breeding range, as you saw on the map, is pretty big. It's a good chunk of Canada and then the northern US as well. And the winter range is considerably smaller. And so that means that the density of the rails on the winter grounds is higher than it is on their breeding grounds. And so as a species of greatest conservation need, management activities on the wintering areas can potentially have a really pronounced effect. And so obviously fires are important for maintaining suitable habitat conditions. But because they're there in the winter, when you're burning is also when they are there. And so this has been linked to both direct and indirect mortality. So across most of the area where we were looking at them, usually there was like one individual per hectare, and then you'd have spots where you might have up to 5 individuals per hectare. So like San Bernard National Wildlife Refuge had a really high density of both yellow rails and black rails. The populations across the study areas seem to be dominated by young birds, which is both a good and a bad thing. So they have good recruitment every year, but it also means like if failure of recruitment one year could potentially have a pretty noticeable effect on the numbers. They seem to come back to spots around the same time as the black rails-ish. So in Florida, some of them were popping up at around 11 months, so a little bit later than the black rails. And we also found them in sites that hadn't been burned for many years. If you look at sites that have been burned within 3 months, we didn't have any individuals there. And then the number of individuals that are found seems to gradually decline with time post-burn. So they'll use it, but it's perhaps not as preferred as more recently burned stuff. So the yellow rails in the winter are more likely to increase in number if you've got relatively high stem density. So they want slightly different stuff than black rails, so they overlap substantially. And then they want kind of lower vegetation as well. So generally speaking, the high marsh conditions that are used by the yellow rails are going to overlap with that of the black rails. We also found yellow rails in some of the spots where we weren't finding black rails, suggesting that they may have a wider range of wintering habitats that they will use. They also would tend to use wetter areas than the black rails, and they seem less concerned about having those rail tunnels to run through. And so we usually find them in areas where there's like greater than 80% canopy coverage. You're looking for it. So sort of tying it back in together, because that's kind of a lot there. So when you are managing this woody vegetation encroachment, trying to keep the black rail habitat going, mottled ducks seem to be relatively neutral to it. Yellow rails seem to prefer areas that are somewhat thicker with less variable understory cover. And so you should be able to use prescribed fire to create patchy burns, and that resulting heterogeneity should benefit the black rails and the yellow rails, and then also mottled ducks. And then towards the end of this, some of the group got really interested in seaside sparrows. And that in turn will depend on like how the fire is moving through the management unit, how the fire is utilized over time, how it's rotated, and so on and so forth. So to tie this all together in sort of a little figure for the timing of some of these things, the yes is in the blue for the most part. And so if you're burning for like November, December, or January, then you should have, mottled ducks that will start using it perhaps within 6 months or so. If you are burning in February, mottled ducks can potentially be breeding, and so there may be potential issues with that focal species. With yellow rails, the yellow rails are present in the winter, and so obviously a winter burn is then going to affect the presence of those birds. If you do it as a slow burn, so they can get out of the way, and if you do it as a patchy burn, so they've got some refugia, then it should be reasonable. And then with black rails generally start breeding in April, but there are exceptions. So they may start pair bonding as early as February. So we found them pair bonding in February, and sometimes they lay nests in late March, but usually it's more like April. And so dormant season burns should be okay-ish for them. And then obviously there's issues with like logistics and ease and so on. Like it's tricky to burn in July and August, and the logistics are harder to get to, and so on and so forth. So kind of tying this up with summary recommendations across the Gulf of Mexico, or across the Gulf, you want frequent prescribed fire. If you are doing this in Florida, doing it as like a 2-year return interval is a pretty good idea. If you're doing this in Texas, it's going to depend on where in Texas you are doing the burn. And so a lot of that is going to depend upon local knowledge and feel for what the vegetation structure looks like. But in Texas anyway, shooting for like a 3 to 4 year burn would be reasonable. And then if you're going considerably further south down to Padre Island, potentially a longer burn might be called for in some of these drier areas. And so obviously these things should be adjusted as needed. If you're going to do frequent fire application, you're going to obviously want to come up with burn prioritization plans because you've got only so many units that you can handle in a given amount of time. What we would recommend is you'll want to target areas that look like they should potentially have black rails or perhaps some of these other focal species. If you're managing for the black rails, you should also be able to sustain breeding habitat for mottled ducks, and you'll get reasonable numbers of yellow rails potentially using it in the year after the burn. If you can provide refugia is hugely helpful. So for the yellow rails, as part of the project, there were a couple cases where people saw them walking away from the fire and then crossing over the burn line and then moving into a nearby patch. And so as long as the fire is not moving too quickly, they can get away from it. And if you can provide those refugia, it gives them something to get away with. In areas where you have eastern black rails, having the burn not go through super fast is going to be really helpful. But obviously that comes with its own logistical constraints. So if you are burning and you're trying to burn slow, there's only so many hours in a day. The fire crews are going to need to plan for the extended time it's going to complete it, and you want to be as efficient as possible. But those slow burns do seem to be really helpful for not causing direct mortality of the rails. There can still be indirect mortality, so as they're moving around, they become visible, and when they're visible, predators can go after them. But the slower burns seem to be very helpful for them surviving it. So in the Eastern Gulf, heading fires seem to be really good. Doing them at like a 2-ish year return interval seem to work fairly well. Over in Texas, you'll want to have the fire return interval stretched out probably a little bit longer depending on local conditions. And patchy burns are really, really nice. So condensing it down even further, just to make sure that these take-home messages didn't get lost in my really long-winded expose here. For the FireBird Fire Manual, which should be coming out next summer, and which is going to go into more detail and nuance than what I'm getting here, the first recommendation was looking at the frequency in which management units are treated. So in an area with high rainfall and rapid regrowth like Florida, 2 years works well. If you stretch it out much beyond 2 years in parts of Florida, things like the wax myrtle regrow surprisingly quick. In Texas, it should be longer than that. So more like 4-ish years would be reasonable-ish. The season in which the unit is treated, there's some stuff that we found that suggested that perhaps doing it during like August might be better, but overall, dormant conditions are okay. And given that that's when everybody's burning anyway, that is probably best to just kind of leave it alone. The extent of the burn unit being treated, patchy burns that are going to leave refugia seems to be enormously helpful with ensuring short-term survival to the extent that we could ascertain that. The specific weather conditions, I really hope it's not going to reach 50 degrees Celsius in the wintertime. But anyway, cooler conditions are better. So ideally, if you're going to be doing these sort of slow burn, patchy things, shoot for within 3 days after a rain event if you can. Your fuel stuff should be relatively damp, the relative humidity be high, there'd be cloudy, not much wind. Basically start it in the morning as best you can. And then the ignition technique used to apply the fires, whenever possible, slow fires are going to be best for managing these things. So flank or backing or something to prevent it from just kind of racing on through. And with that, I think I'll start taking any questions.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Butler. I saw there was one in the chat that came through from Taylor. It was did this research have any recommendations for ecosystem resilience?
Oh, that is an excellent question. It wasn't a primary focus of the FireBird project, and it's something that really does need to be investigated. So, oh yeah, feel free to type the questions in, because obviously seeing people's raised hands can be tricky. So we don't have any specific recommendations that we want to formally announce for ecosystem resilience at this time. Hopefully within a few more years, as we can do some follow-up things, we'll be better able to address some of those things.
Great. I had one question. So you mentioned, keeping the fire in the high marsh areas. So if you're trying to keep it out of the low marsh, is that something that kind of happens naturally because it's already, higher moisture or potentially, filled with water, or are you creating, burn lines to specifically keep it out of the lower marsh areas?
Yeah, it can vary depending upon what the goals are. The lower marsh doesn't burn as easily, but usually people are putting the burn lines in to make sure that it stays within the unit of interest. Okay, so the question was, do I agree with the historical fire frequencies in the papers were cited based on the FireBird research, or should we adapt those? That's another really good question. So I think it depends on what the goals are. And so broadly speaking, it's possible that there could be a slight mismatch between historical fire frequencies and what is best for maintaining like the threatened eastern black rail. And so you might have an area that had a more frequent fire return interval of like 2 to 3 years or something, and the black rails would only be able to use that habitat for perhaps 1 year, but with enough area across the landscape, they could move between them. Now with the increasingly fragmented landscape, that may be more problematic, and it's possible maybe that explains that gap in their current range, since they don't seem to occur in Alabama, Mississippi, or eastern Louisiana anymore. So if I was going to say this for Texas, I would actually make the fire return intervals be a little bit longer than those that were the historical ones. So something like 4 or 5 years for units rather than doing it every 2 to 3. And those longer fire return intervals would allow better time for conditions to build up to become more suitable for things like black rails. That said, obviously ground conditions can vary tremendously between sites. So if you start planning for it as like a 4 or 5 year, and then you see a bunch of Baccharis invading, then obviously adapt it as necessary. Did that answer the question?
Yes, it did, Dr. Butler. And then I put another question in there too.
Okay. Oh yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with those longer fire return intervals, would we still be able to achieve the mosaic patchiness that appears beneficial? And the answer is, I think so. So let's see. With FireBird, we specifically looked at 2 versus 4 year fire return intervals. And so me suggesting 4 to 5 is a little bit beyond the 4 years that we looked at. But if you can rotate so that you've got varying units being burned at various times. So not everything is burned uniformly across the area every 4 years. You should still be able to get a pretty wide range of mosaic patchiness that would be beneficial for all three focal species. And again, Texas is huge. And so stuff that works in Port Arthur and Beaumont and the Chenier Plains may need to be modified for like Padre Island National Seashore or Matagorda or wherever you might particularly be working. So the last question is, when is the guidebook coming out? So it is off at the printers, is being put out by Mississippi State. Everything in academia moves slow. So I was hoping that we'd at least have a draft version that we could share at this point, and we don't, and it looks like it'll be another few months. So what I'm told at the moment is late spring, early summer of 2026. And what I can do is once it comes out, I can share that with Morgan and David, and then we can pass it along to people who might be interested and provide it as a link to like a PDF rather than making people buy a printed out copy. Right. Okay, and then let's see, 2 more questions have popped up. So there was a question, given fragmentation is mentioned, have any studies been done to investigate how prescribed fire producing the patchy habitat affects ecology and space use of potential nest predators? And so for the FireBird project, that was not something that we've looked at. And so that is not something I can answer directly from this research. Kind of big picture, edge effects are a real thing with potential nest predators. And so when you end up with patchy habitat, you are potentially creating a series of edges that may be more attractive to potential nest predators. It's not something that I think has been well investigated in high salt marsh. I'm not sure that it's really been investigated that much at all. So there's a PhD student, Lauren Monopoly, who's at the University of Illinois, who is looking at nest use in high salt marsh in Louisiana. And as part of it, with the monitoring, she's looking at potential nest predators. But I don't know that she has any conclusions yet. I think she still has another couple years to wrap up her PhD. So the short answer is, it seems plausible that it could potentially affect the ecology and space use of nest predators, but I don't know that we have a good enough idea to say with certainty how it does so. Okay, and then let's see. There's another question in your burn unit slide with the 3 different types of fires to use to burn the unit. Are you using the all-weather cliche roads for your fire guards / burnout boundaries? And so in that particular one, where was that one taken? I think that was actually from Florida, was that picture there, rather than from Texas. And so I don't believe the roads there are actually cliche. But in that particular example, which was, where was that one? St. Mark's. I think that was at St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. They were, I think, using those roads as the burn unit boundary. Okay, excellent. This is great that we're getting questions here. Okay, next one is, you touched on mottled duck. Made me wonder, have you seen benefits or changes in other notable game waterfowl species from these burns? Thinking of a landowner perspective who may want to manage their property for improved duck hunting or improved game habitat. Again, not a part of the FireBird project, so not a definitive answer. But stuff grows back pretty quickly, and when you have rapid regeneration of this sort of grassy vegetation, that can be really nice for waterfowl to feed upon, at least the ones that are feeding upon vegetation and not, say, the diving ducks. And so what I would expect is that the burns should improve the number of waterfowl in that particular area. And just anecdotally, that's what I remember seeing. But we didn't generate any sort of recommendations for it. Other questions? You're welcome.
One quick question. I guess just the majority of these burns that y'all are conducting, are these primarily on federal lands, or is it, partner landowners that you're doing some private land, or what does the majority or kind of the landscape look like?
Yeah, so let's see. Florida was all federal land. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana was a combination of state, federal, and private landowner. And then Texas was federal and state, I think. And so kind of a mixture of everything. Honestly, what I'm really hoping to do as part of the follow-on to this is I want to work with people further down the Texas coast, because we really don't have a large enough sample along the mid-coast or the south coast to really get a feel for this. Although, to be fair, black rails kind of peter out by the time you get down to like Corpus or so. So there's small numbers in Corpus, and then they don't really normally go much further, although every once in a while they turn up down at Laguna Atascosa. Same thing with yellow rails. Yeah, there's a question about seaside sparrows. So I think one of your slides included seaside sparrow in the list. They show similar responses to fire with black rail. So within like the last 2 years of the project, some of the group got interested in seaside sparrow, and they actually put some of the stuff about seaside sparrow management with prescribed fire in the manual. And so there's going to be more detailed stuff about that in the manual. I wasn't one of those people, and so the recommendations I'm less familiar with for that particular bird. But from what I remember, they did seem to show a similar pattern to the black rail. So they like the somewhat older stuff. Okay, so the question is, can you tell us more about the FireBird project? How long will this work continue? Okay, so the FireBird project, we put together the proposal back in 2019. Ariel Fournier from University of Illinois and Mark Woodry from Mississippi State were the co-leads on this, and the rest of us kind of piled in as we got into our respective areas of interest. So we put it in 2019, and then COVID hit in 2020, which kind of knocked our plans out of whack a little bit. So we ended up running this. It was supposed to run from 2019 through 2024. It's run through 25 now. We just wrapped it all up. We've put on an addendum to see if we can do a follow-up 5-year study. No guarantees about any of this, but it looks tentatively promising that NOAA is interested in continuing to go on with this work. So there's some interesting things that we're potentially spinning off, like salt marsh restoration. There's reasonable stuff for like low marsh restoration, but there's not really work on restoring high marsh. So the planting the grasses in low marsh and so on, that's reasonably well worked out. But trying to build back up high marsh back behind it is not. Looking at how longer fire regimes might come into play, especially in drier areas, is one of the things that we're hoping to look at, and so on. So if it all goes well, maybe March of 26, we will get the go ahead, and then we can start working out more of these details. So hopefully this might continue for another 5-ish years or so. All right, and I think I might have an Aggie here. So somebody said howdy, Chris. So I'll say howdy back. Might have several Aggies here, given the large number of people that signed up for this.
Yeah, I don't type very fast. part of the Aggie syndrome. But I was going to recommend, if you are not currently working with Jake Herring at Nueces Bays and Estuary Program.
Yeah.
Do you know Jake?
Not very well.
Okay.
I know the name and I've got a face, but I don't know him particularly well.
Okay, I can make that connection. That would be a great resource if you wanted to push that that marsh research down into the Corpus area, Nueces Bay area. They have a ton of marsh habitat access in that area.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much.
No problem. I'll shoot that to you.
Awesome. If anyone else has any more questions, this is the time for Dr. Butler.
We can talk about the ball if you want.
Yeah.
You're doing pretty good this year.
There you go. Just a thought. You mentioned looking to do more work along, the Texas Middle Coast and whatnot, and finding maybe land partners and stuff. So would potentially partnerships with a newly forming prescribed burn association along the coast, would that be a group that y'all would try and work with?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because there's that gap, right, in the prescribed burning areas, and that gap is right in where we'd like to do some more stuff. So that would be really useful to link up with the new group as it's getting put together.
Definitely.
Yeah. Oh, and then Kristen typed in, have you worked at Mustang Island State Park? We could get you set up there as well. So this wasn't a FireBird project, but for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, I had a grad student look at different ways of surveying rails. So she was trying to figure out the most efficient way to do it, whether it was these autonomous recording units, the microphones, the marsh, whether it was going out and standing in the marsh to try and see them or hear them. We actually got a little drone with an infrared camera, and we were just using it to fly around the marsh, and we were able to find rails that way, which was really cool. But as part of that for TPWD, we worked on Mustang Island, and there were black rails down there. And so, depending on how FireBird 2 happens and how far we want to extend things and everything, that could potentially be useful as well. Let's see. All right, there we go. Okay. Next one is any interactions with the species studied and smoke in terms of attracting them. So for this study, that was not something that we looked at. We did see the rails running away from the fire a couple times, and there were raptors around that seemed keen to keep an eye on things that might be moving away from the fires. We didn't actually observe the raptors directly depredating any of the rails. The rails are really hard to see. So when you have things moving around in the landscape in response to a fire, it's entirely possible that there may be sort of indirect mortality associated with predation. I don't know that any of the species that we worked with, focal species, were attracted to the smoke per se, but some of their predators might have been. Okay. Next one is any advantage of rice field burn-off, pro and con. Actually, Dennis, if you're on, can you tell me a little bit more about what you might have in mind for that one?
Dennis, you are muted right now. Still muted, Dennis. Not sure if you're typing or if you're speaking.
Well, I can just kind of roll with my thought, and then Dennis can chime in and get me on track for what he's interested in. So let's see. with like Louisiana's Rails and Rice Festival, where they have the people come along and ride on the tractor and see the rails getting kicked up. After the rice fields have been harvested, the cover is too sparse for rails to really use them anymore. So it's a temporary use of the field by yellow rails. The black rails don't actually seem to really pop up in those rice fields because the rice isn't really clumpy in the same way the Spartina is. The black rails don't seem to use it. And so, okay, so I am on the same page. Yeah. So after the harvest, the rails aren't really using them, not even the yellow rails. And so burning off of it doesn't really do much directly for the rails one way or the other. And then it's not really necessarily doing much with the regrowth, obviously, because it's planting that is driving the regrowth of those rice fields. Excellent. I made sense. I'll have to tell my students that I made sense once today. Okay, Ashley said there was a small study done in Oasis Delta. I can send you the final document. Yeah, Ashley, that would be fantastic. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to see that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Morgan said always the Raptors, and yes, always the Raptors.
All right. Well, does anyone have any kind of final questions for Dr. Butler before we pivot into the next quick point? Well, anyways, I'll start talking a little bit, and if again anyone has any lingering questions for Dr. Butler, put them in the chat. But first, just want to say thank you so much for that presentation. That was really interesting, and that's really impressive work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that you guys were interested in this. I think it's really interesting, and I'm very hopeful that fire manual, when it comes out, will be useful to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait. So just the next kind of topic that we're going to jump into before we wrap up is the efforts to start a new prescribed burn association along the Texas Middle Coast, the Gulf Coast PBA. So kind of in those efforts right now, there's kind of a big empty gap on the Texas coast where there isn't an active prescribed burn association. And in the Houston, Galveston area, and north of that, we have the East Texas Prescribed Burn Association, which started in late 2024, and then further down on the coast, starting around Aransas County, we have the Coastal Bend Prescribed Burn Association. But between roughly, Lake Jackson and I guess I'd say Port Aransas, there's kind of a big empty spot on the map. So we're really looking to fill that in and create a collective of landowners, community members, anyone who's interested in partnering together for the use of prescribed fire, whether that's for wildfire mitigation, improving habitat for coastal species, managing woody encroachment. Just speaking on prescribed burn associations, I know we have several members in the audience who are part of the South Central Texas Prescribed Burn Association, just to the northwest of this these coastal counties, and plenty of other people who are part of PBAs who can speak on the benefits that a prescribed burn association provides. First and foremost, it's just the sharing of knowledge. If you're interested in running prescribed fire on your property, having someone or having a group of people who are willing to give you their time, expertise, and then of course sharing in equipment, showing up to a burn, providing those volunteer hours, showing up with whether it's drip torches, suppression equipment, whatever it may be. The benefits of a prescribed burn association, we can talk about them for hours, but that's one of our goals, is to try and generate interest among landowners in this area, and hopefully we have some people here in the chat, and after this we're going to send a survey and just kind of a poll, trying to see who's interested in potentially joining a new PBA, but just wanted to touch on that first and foremost. And if anyone has any kind of questions about, PBA membership, what that looks like, you can drop it in the chat or go to me directly after the call. But I can say for the most part, dues for PBAs are generally, $30 a year, and what that gets you, more than pays for itself. And then, like I mentioned, I know we have a few people from the South Central Texas PBA in the chat, and I'm not sure, have y'all seen interest or seen landowners in these coastal areas that are interested in burning, and just maybe speaking on y'all's PBA and y'all's efforts. What, if any, trainings are necessary before joining PBA? No trainings or no certifications are needed to join a prescribed burn association. It's really, if you're just looking to get your foot in the door, and whether you've been on a bunch of fires or you've never been on a fire, a PBA is great because you're instantly going to get connected with people who know what they're doing, have been on fires, and they can kind of teach you on the way up. On the first fire, you may be carrying a drip torch, or you may be on the suppression side, but they'll show you the right way to do things, and are a great knowledge sharing resource. And then again, other prescribed burn associations, in my experience, are always willing to come out and help other associations, especially as they're forming, kind of get their feet wet. But yes, like Morgan mentioned in the chat, there are a variety of prescribed burn schools you can look at. AgriLife has an online prescribed burn school. I can send that post or after this Zoom meeting. That's a great way. It'll kind of show you the ins and outs of what goes into conducting a burn. It'll talk about laws and regulations, the tools you need to get started, really from top to bottom. And then, of course, there are also in-person prescribed burn schools. These can be, run by either AgriLife, Texas A&M Forest Service. There are some prescribed burn associations who have developed their own prescribed burn schools. So that's a great way to have at least some initial training before getting involved with prescribed fire. But to answer your specific question, you don't need to have any trainings before joining a PBA.
David, so
yes, sir.
Just to kind of get a little clarity for myself. So I'm located in Rockport, that's Aransas County. And I know Coastal Bend is really active, kind of based out of Victoria area.
Yeah.
And then also just kind of make the statement, like the fire culture is pretty huge down here, has been historically, from your rice field stuff up to the north, extending down to, your large ranch country a little further south of here. Like Chris was saying, the frequency is drastically different. So I would say, that Victoria area already has a really strong foothold in a PBAT. And I'm guessing you're trying to fill in just north of there over to Houston.
Right.
Are you familiar with Stephen Gertz and Palacios with Nature Conservancy?
The name sounds familiar. I'm sure even if I don't know him, I'm sure there's other people
I'll
who
get y'all connected, because Gertz. Yes, sir, go ahead.
This is Chuck Linton. Let me jump in here. We've been working with Nature Conservancy. We've been working with oh gosh, I forgot his name. Just
Callan.
Who?
Callan Coleman.
Yeah, Callan Coleman.
Yep.
And Callan has hosted several meetings in that upper coastal area. where we've had landowners show up. I don't know if any of them are on this call. It sounds like most of the people on this call are more in the burn community already. But, you know, we've made several attempts at trying to get a PBA off the ground with Callan has kind of been at the forefront of that. I mean, David, what's your sense? Do you actually have some landowners on here that?
Yeah, so it's hard, a little bit hard to say because we you know, there's not as many people in the call right now that registered, but in the registration there was a poll, and I'd say I believe it is 40 to 50% of them were landowners along the coastal or in these coastal counties. So I think there is definitely an interest. Of course, the next hurdle is, you know, identifying leadership, you know, someone who, you know, would be willing to be a president of the Prescribed Burn Association, and, you know, just getting that established. But I believe there is, you know, I believe there is plenty of landowners who are interested. We just need to kind of round them up and, you know, get things off the ground.
Yeah, we don't even need to couch it in terms of leadership at this point. If
Yeah.
we just have a group of people that were interested enough to form an exploratory committee to figure, or for lack of a better term,
Yeah,
just figure out.
and luckily, like Brad mentioned, luckily there's surrounding areas with an already established fire culture, and, you know, PBAs that I know would be willing to help and, you know, lend their expertise. And I'm sure there's already people in these counties, you know, doing their prescribed burns just by themselves. So I think
these guys that are already like Callan, like Steven, like these guys can help connect these dots pretty quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, Tom in the chat made a good point. You know, with burning on the coast, goes into extra regulations with smoke and, you know, burning in coastal marshes. And Chris, Dr. Butler, if you're still here, actually, I kind of just a question: do you run into a lot of hurdles with you know, burning in these coastal, you know, grass communities and the regulations that come along with it?
It's not the easiest thing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to dot your I's and cross your T's, and honestly, cross your fingers and toes too.
Definitely. Well, anyways, that's unless anyone has any kind of additional questions or topics they'd like to bring up, we can look to wrap this up. And again, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Butler for that presentation. It was really a really worthwhile project, and hope to see it extended for that, you know, five more years, and hopefully 5 more years after that. And then wanted to thank everyone who joined us today. Just and participated. It's great to see everyone out here. And I know I said it before, but you will be receiving a follow-up email from me. That's going to have just a quick survey. I'm going to send you a few links to connect you with the Prescribed Burn Alliance of Texas website that can connect you with any and all fire resources. And then lastly, if you are looking for some continuing fire training credits, please reach out to me directly. I'll be available via email, and we'd love to get those over to you. So yeah, again, thank you to everyone.